Greetings, everyone, and welcome to part 5 of my presentation titled Tracing the Origin of the Word God. My name is Larry Atchison. If you saw part 4 of this presentation, you may recall I primarily focused on the teaching that God must be an okay title for the Creator if it's going to be one of the 12 names on the gates of the New Jerusalem. That argument appears reasonable enough when you conduct surface research, but it falls flat when you drill deeper into all the facts and contingencies that you must accept if you go along with that teaching. At best, you're stuck with believing that it's okay to apply the name of a man as a title for the creator of the universe. I also covered the fact that righteous believers who were named after pagan idols were not expected to change their names when they converted to faith in Yahweh. But now we move on to part 5, where I present how to say the word reptile in Russian, how to say snake in Gaelic. I will also combine all the points I've made throughout the course of this presentation, and once we connect all the dots, we should have a clear understanding of the origin of the word God. So now we begin part 5. As I just said, once I finish this presentation, we will have connected all the dots and we will see the path the word God has taken as it made its way to the English language. When we're finished, I would like to do a comparison between the origin supplied by most scholars and the origin I have found in my own independent research. But notice I'm labeling this presentation Part 5A. That means there will be a Part 5B. After careful deliberation and consulting with my wife and friends, it was decided that there is simply too much information in Part 5 to record an entire session. Yet, it's also so tightly connected that it really needs to all be considered Part 5. If you want to watch an entire session of Part 5, I delivered Part 5 as part of a Zoom presentation in January 2023, but I cut out some parts so as to not exceed the 2 hours. For Parts 5A and B, I will try to not cut out anything from the original presentation. In fact, I've actually incorporated a new slide that wasn't a part of the original. So let's get started. Many of us have either heard of a 1960s TV show called The Twilight Zone, hosted by Rod Serling, or else we've watched some of the episodes. The stories generally consisted of nightmares that really came true, or at least they really came true for the actors each week. I watched The Twilight Zone as a child, and the show actually gave me nightmares. Rod Serling would always give viewers an opening narrative to introduce them to each episode, and one line I especially remember from one episode is him telling the audience that what the character was about to experience was too incredible to be real, too real to be a dream. That line comes close to describing the journey we're taking with this presentation. The only difference is the incredible journey we're on is 100% real. Everything I've presented in this presentation is real and it's based on truth. But it's so contrary to how we've all been raised and taught to believe that it seems too incredible to be true. As I mentioned in a previous presentation, the message I'm bringing here is not one that I can share with the average believer. As you most likely know, believers in the Creator as revealed in the Bible are becoming fewer and fewer. But those few who are left are oftentimes not able to receive or accept the message I'm bringing in this presentation. Of course, non-believers are even more unlikely to accept the message. But it's too incredible to be real and too real to be a dream. In fact, it is real and it is the truth. With my previous presentations, I've gone into lengthy reviews of previous presentations. With this one, I'm only going to offer the following review as taken from Part 2. You may recall from Part 2 where I shared the discussion I had with my brother while on a plane in San Diego, California, as we awaited its departure for Dallas, Texas. I love my brother very much, but whereas I departed the Methodist church I was raised in due to our many doctrinal disagreements, my brother remains a Methodist to this day. Anyway, as we sat on the airplane that day back in the year 2015, he threw in a comment about his personal feeling that my family and I go overboard with our beliefs. And I replied with a two-part illustration to help him think about whether or not I really go overboard. Part 1 was to show him that God is not the only name of a pagan idol that Bible translators have hidden from us. In Acts chapter 14, we read about the pagan priests in the city of Lystra wanting to offer sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas after Paul healed a man who had been crippled from birth. Nearly all English translators identify the pagan idol those priests worshipped as either Zeus or Jupiter. But anyone who knows Greek can read for themselves that the actual name of the pagan deity in the original language is not Zeus or Jupiter, it's Dios. But Dios is the name the Spanish culture uses to refer to the creator of the Bible. So the translators didn't want to make the Spanish culture feel like they worship a heathen idol by referring to the creator with the same name as the heathen idol. So Spanish Bibles render the Dios of Acts chapter 14 verse 13 as Jupiter, or as they pronounce it, Jupiter. And here's a screen capture taken from a Spanish Bible showing what the translators did. We know the name in the actual original Greek text is Dios, but translators of the Spanish Bibles replaced Dios with Jupiter. So just to be clear, long before the Spanish language even existed, the Greek culture was already worshiping a pagan idol named Dios. And today the Spanish culture refers to the true creator of the Bible as Dios, even though we should all know that's not his name. His name is Yahweh, or something very close to that, but definitely not Dios. Now, I have actually had individuals who passed themselves off as knowing Greek, who told me the name of that idol in the Greek text of Acts chapter 14, verse 13 is not pronounced Dios, and that it's actually pronounced Zeus. What they did when they tried to push that false statement off on me was to identify themselves as not knowing Greek. I may not be a Greek scholar, but I do know how to pronounce Greek words, and the name spelled delta, iota, omicron, sigma in Greek is definitely pronounced Dios. In fact, we own a Spanish Bible that we were given back in 1991, in which they clearly render the name of the pagan idol of Acts chapter 14, verse 13 as Dios, not Zeus, and it's most certainly not Jupiter, it's Dios. This is taken from a Bible called Las Escrituras Mesiánicas, which means the Messianic Writings. It was published in 1990 by the Asociación de Investigación Bíblica and printed in the Dominican Republic. And here's an enlargement of the text of Acts chapter 14, verse 13, as it appears in Las Escrituras Mesiánicas. The brethren who published this Bible know and understand the sobering fact that their own culture collectively refers to the Creator with the name of a pagan idol. The Spanish culture refers to the Creator as Dios, but the translator of this Bible plainly reveals the truth that Dios is the name of a heathen idol, and that translator refuses to refer to Yahweh as Dios. I salute the translator of this Bible for refusing to bow to the tradition that is now so deeply embedded in the Spanish culture. Some of you may be familiar with the Hanukkah story. According to the books of Maccabees, the evil Syrian king named Antiochus Epiphanes massacred 40,000 Jews within the space of 3 days and had another 40,000 sold into slavery. This was around the year 168 BCE. Antiochus Epiphanes forbade practicing Torah, and anyone found keeping the Sabbath or circumcising their infants were executed. According to the English translation of 2 Maccabees chapter 6 verse 2, he also renamed the temple in Jerusalem Jupiter Olympius. So we know Jupiter is not the same as Yahweh or even an equivalent to Yahweh. Not at all. Jupiter is not the creator of the Bible. Thankfully, we don't worship Jupiter, nor do I know anyone professing to worship Jupiter. But in 2 Maccabees chapter 6 verse 2, here's what it says. Not long after this, the king sent an old man of Athens to compel the Jews to depart from the laws of their fathers and not to live after the laws of Elohim. Now, I want to pause here for a moment because I know the English translation of this verse reads the laws of God. I drew a red line to show you that the actual Greek word in the Greek text is not God. It's theou, which is a generic Greek term used for divinity. So theou is the Greek equivalent of the Almighty, or if you go with the Hebrew title, it's the equivalent, the same as Elohim. So that's why I choose to read that the Jews were compelled to depart from the laws of Elohim instead of God. It's because I disagree with the translator's decision to translate the Greek title theou into God. It's the same principle I apply when I say I disagree with the translator's decision to translate Elohim as God in our English Bibles today. Anyway, I thought I should at least explain why I do not read the word God when I read the translation of 2 Maccabees 6 verse 2. It's because I believe God is a poor translation at best. Okay, so let's go back to where I started. Not long after this, the king sent an old man of Athens to compel the Jews to depart from the laws of their fathers and not to live after the laws of Elohim, and to pollute also the temple in Jerusalem, and to call it the temple of Jupiter Olympius, and that in Gerizim of Jupiter, the defender of strangers, as they did desire that dwell in the place. But now let's take a closer look at 2 Maccabees chapter 6 verse 2. Don't look at the English translation. Look at the original Greek text over here on the left. It doesn't say that the king renamed the temple Jupiter Olympius. No, it says he renamed it Dios Olympiou. So it wasn't Jupiter, it was Dios. And by the way, Olympiou is a reference to Mount Olympus in Greece. Mount Olympus is the highest mountain in all of Greece, and it was considered to be the seat of the deities. So Antiochus Epiphanes dedicated the temple in honor of Dios, who actually resides on Mount Olympus, at least according to Greek mythology. So renaming the temple Dios Olympiou was a way of letting everyone know that Dios actually resides on Mount Olympus, but he'll let you worship him here at this place in Jerusalem. But my actual point is that Antiochus Epiphanes didn't want to dedicate the temple to the worship of Yahweh. He wanted to dedicate it to the worship of Dios. So if you think Dios is a great name or title to use for the creator of the Bible, I'm sure Antiochus Epiphanes would have agreed with you. And by the way, I highlighted in blue the fact that Antiochus Epiphanes also dedicated the temple in Gerizim to the worship of Dios Zeniu, which means Dios, the protector or patron of strangers. Just in case you didn't already know this, Mount Gerizim is where the Samaritans worship, and they consider it to be the holiest place in the world. So long as you worshipped Dios, then, even if you were a foreigner, Dios would protect you, or at least that's what the pagan Greek culture believed. So back to that day on the airplane with my brother. When I asked my brother if the Spanish culture honors the Creator by referring to him as Dios, he quickly answered, no. But then I showed my brother part 2 of what I wanted to show him. Part 1 was about an idol named Dios, whose name translators cover up so as to allow everyone to think that Dios is the same as Yahweh. And their plan worked, at least for most of the world. Very few people recognized Dios as the name of a false idol. But part 2 is where I showed my brother that the translators did the same exact thing with an idol whose name is God. It's spelled Gimel Daleth in Hebrew, and it's pronounced God. I showed him the text of Isaiah 65:11, the Hebrew text of Isaiah 65:11, and how the correct translation and rendering of that verse should be, "But you are those who forsake Yahweh, who forget my holy mountain, who array a table for God, and who fill mixed wine for Mani." So just to be clear, according to the original Hebrew text of Isaiah 65 verse 11, those who worship God have forsaken Yahweh. And when I showed my brother how the translators not only covered up the name Dios in our Bibles, but also the name God, his tone quickly changed. All of a sudden, my beliefs weren't as overboard as he previously thought. Although I didn't change his mind about God, he confided that he now respects my belief. But to many people, the concern isn't about what Yahweh thinks about God, but rather it's what they think about God. Many people have told me, well, that's not what God means to me. They don't realize that this isn't about them. I'm not interested in what God means to them. I am interested in what God means to Yahweh, and all it takes is one verse for us to know what God means to Yahweh. It's a name identifying a pagan idol. That's what God means to Yahweh, and if Yahweh doesn't want us incorporating the name God into our worship, then I don't either. So as we move on with part 5, I want to finish what I started in part 3. In part 3, I established the fact that a pagan deity named God was worshipped in the ancient cities of Haran, Dura Europos, and Palmyra. If that's the only place on the planet offering evidence that an idol named God was worshipped there, I probably wouldn't have much of a case validating how God came to end up in our Bibles, and how nearly everyone out there thinks God is the Creator's name. But our journey has only just begun. And as we make our way to our final destination, the connection will be clear. And to establish my case, I will list all the connections. I will connect the dots. So let's get started. So here's a map I displayed in part 3. This map shows 3 cities where an idol named God was worshipped: Haran, Dura Europos, and Palmyra.
We covered the fact that according to the book of Enoch, the being who deceived Eve was none other than that old serpent, the devil. But his name wasn't Satan or even Lucifer. No, it was Gadriel. This slide shows an excerpt from the book of Enoch, chapter 69, verse 6 of the R.H. Charles translation. Now, I realize someone may regard my citation from the book of Enoch as an indication that I regard it as an inspired book. I have never made such a claim, and regardless of how anyone regards the book of Enoch, the fact remains that most scholars agree that it was written no later than the 2nd century BCE. That's some 200 years before Yeshua Messiah was born. So regardless of whether or not it's an inspired writing, the fact remains that at the very least, a 2nd century BCE writer believed that the name of the serpent who deceived Eve is Gadriel. We need to consider the fact that the short form of Gadriel is God. Let's face it, the short form of Yahweh is Yah. The short form of Gadriel is God. As I mentioned in part 3, I realize someone is bound to say I've gone too far in making the claim that God is the short form of Gadriel. I've been told that no, the short form of Gadriel is not God, but rather Gadar, and that Gadriel actually means wall of Elohim. But as you can see here, scholars are not at all unified as to the actual meaning of Gadriel. Maybe it doesn't mean wall of Elohim after all. Maybe it means Elohim is my helper. And if they don't really know for sure what it really means, how do we know they know where it came from? How do we know whether or not its original meaning is God, the evil Elohim? Then there's Godon, the deity whose name was shortened to God, the same God that we see in most English Bibles today. This is information found in a book written by a highly respected 18th century etymologist named Daniel Fenning.
And here's a scanned copy from page 140 of Daniel Fenning's book. You might think of Daniel Fenning as the Noah Webster of 18th century England, as he also compiled the Royal English Dictionary in 1761, and it was the standard dictionary of England for many years. Daniel Fenning traces the God of our English and German Bibles to a contraction of the name Godon, contracted to God. This information is such an important piece to the puzzle that I'm including it as one of the dots that we need to connect. And please remember that to Daniel Fenning, this was mere trivia, a curious tidbit about how the English translation God made it into our Bibles. He himself had no problem referring to the Almighty as God. So Daniel Fenning, by all accounts, was unbiased in what he wrote. Our next connecting dot is the fact that an idol named God was worshipped in the area known as Haran. I know the King James Version spells this name H-A-R-A-N, but since modern maps spell it with two R's, that's what I'm doing here. I covered the fact that God was worshipped in Haran in parts 1, 2, 3, and 4 of this presentation. And if that's not enough, I go into even more detail validating this fact in our online study titled God's Identity According to Ancient Hebrew Scholars. And that's available on our website at www.ponderscripture.org. The fact that an idol named God was worshipped in Haran is important, and we're about to see why this fact is so important. And here's another look at the map displaying not only Haran, but the known region where archaeologists have found inscriptions dedicated to God. I need to emphasize that this triangular area only represents the known region where the deity named God was worshipped. Is it possible the worship of God extended beyond this region? Of course, the answer is yes, but for now, my point is, God was indeed worshipped in Haran. And let's not forget the fact that scholarly references spell this deity's name out as G-A-D in English. This is an obvious attempt to distinguish the pagan idol from the English Bible's G-O-D. Most casual English speakers think G-A-D is the name of a pagan idol and G-O-D is the name of the true creator. Very few people out there know that both words are spelled the same in Hebrew, and even fewer know that they are also pronounced the same in Hebrew. And that pronunciation is God. I covered all this in part 1, so if you missed it, I should let you know that part 1 is now available for viewing on our website. Most important of all is the fact that nowhere in all of Scripture is the true creator ever referred to as God in the original language. God is simply the word translators chose to use when translating the Hebrew title Elohim, and I dare say the adversary inspired them to do it, not Yahweh. So why is it so important that I mentioned the fact that God was worshipped in Haran? It's because that's where sisters Leah and Rachel were born and raised. They were right there in the midst of a region where idolatry was in vogue. But this raises another question. So think about this. We all know who Rebekah was, right? Rebekah was the wife of the righteous Isaac. And Rebekah's brother was a man named Laban, and Laban lived in Haran. Laban was the father of Leah and Rachel, so Laban was Jacob's uncle on his mother's side. We all know the story of how Jacob stole his brother Esau's birthright and how Jacob moved up north and ended up in his uncle's hometown of Haran. Of course, he fell in love with Rachel. We all know the rest of the story. But since Rachel's dad, Laban, was Rebekah's brother, this surely means that Laban was a righteous man, correct? Even though he lived in the midst of an idolatrous region, he himself worshipped Yahweh only, correct? Well, if you believe that Laban was a righteous man who only worshipped Yahweh, you may want to reread the book of Genesis. Laban was an idol worshiper like everyone else in his region, or at least the Bible doesn't mention anyone in that area who rejected idol worship. And this brings me to my next important point, my next dot. The fact is, both Leah and Rachel worshipped idols. You don't have to believe me, but hopefully you can believe what the Bible says. In Genesis 35, verse 2, Jacob was compelled to command his household and all that were with him to put away all the strange Elohim that were among them. Telling them to put away the strange Elohim that were among them is a polite way of saying he told them to get rid of the idols they were worshiping. I have a difficult time believing they had strange Elohim if they didn't worship those strange Elohim. I've been told I'm a naive person, but I'm not that naive. Now, we've all been led to believe that Leah and Rachel were righteous women, and I'm persuaded that Leah eventually came around to faith in Yahweh. But as of Genesis 35, verse 2, She and her sister Rachel were idol worshippers. So let's connect the dots with the fact that Leah was raised by an idol worshiper, and until the day when her husband finally commanded her and the rest of his household to put away the idols they were worshiping, that's what she did. And she was still an idol worshiper when she left Haran with her husband Jacob and family. My next important point is the fact that Leah named Zilpah's son God. We hopefully know the story behind Leah giving Zilpah's son the name God. Leah wasn't giving her husband Jacob any children, so somehow she considered the act of giving her handmaid Zilpah to Jacob to have children in her place as being the same thing as her being the actual mother. So when Zilpah gave birth to a son, Leah essentially exclaimed, "With God's help," which is an acceptable translation of the Hebrew phrase, "by God," as I covered in Part 3. Miles Coverdale, in the translation he produced in 1535, had Leah say, "This is good luck." And of course, God is the idol of good fortune, or as some would say, good luck. We know Leah was raised in a pagan environment. So did she name Zilpah's son after the deity of fortune named God? Or, as some would have you believe, was she inspired by the Holy Spirit to come up with that name? To me, the answer is obvious. I have extensively covered the fact that Jacob tolerated idol worship in his household the entire time they were in Haran, which is a period of 20 years. It wasn't until they left Haran and were on their journey to Canaan that Jacob commanded his household to get rid of the idols that were in their possession. This is an important point because the opposition claims that if there had been anything at all pagan about the name God, Jacob would not have permitted Leah to name Zilpah's son God. The fact is, Jacob tolerated idol worship the entire time he stayed in Haran. So would Jacob have stopped Leah from giving his son the name God? No, he would not have stopped her. I can imagine that Grandpa Laban was elated that Leah named Zilpah's son God. I have already covered the fact that in Exodus 23 verse 13, we are commanded to not mention the names of other Elohim. Now, of course, the command to not speak the names of heathen idols wasn't actually given until after the Exodus from Egypt, or at least that's where the first record of such a commandment is found. We've already covered those verses, Exodus 23 verse 13, where we are commanded to make no mention of the name of other Elohim. And that command is repeated in Joshua 23 verses 6 and 7. And here's a refresher slide just to reinforce the fact that we really aren't supposed to be mentioning the names of heathen idols, at least not in a reverent or positive light. Elijah mentioned the name of the heathen idol Baal, but it was in a disparaging way. But since the direct command to not mention the name of other Elohim wasn't given until Moses and the Israelites left Egypt, someone might well argue, well, before the events recorded in the book of Exodus, it was okay to mention the names of heathen idols, even in a praiseworthy way. I cannot imagine any true believers having ever done such a thing, but Someone from the opposing side is bound to say that before the commandment was given in Exodus 23 verse 13, it was okay to mention the names of heathen idols in a praiseworthy or otherwise non-critical way. If that is so, isn't it interesting that apart from Leah giving Zilpah's son the name God, there are no records of true believers, even before the exodus from Egypt, naming their offspring after a heathen idol? Why would a true believer want to perpetuate the name of a heathen idol through his or her offspring? Why would a true believer want to name his child God when God is known as the name of a heathen idol? One of the great mysteries of the Bible is how Jacob, the son of the righteous Isaac, tolerated idol worship the entire 20 years of his residence in Haran. But it's a scriptural fact. And if you don't believe me, just reread Genesis chapter 35, and you can stop reading at verse 2. Another important point that needs to be factored into this discussion is how ancient believers understood the intent of the command to not mention the names of other Elohim. It would obviously be difficult to tell someone that a certain deity is a false deity without identifying it by name. So in this presentation, I have addressed the fact that ancient believers understood this command to be a directive against mentioning the names of other Elohim in a worshipful or otherwise positive way. An example I used earlier in this presentation is that of Elijah. Did Elijah violate the command to not mention the names of other Elohim when he told the people, "If Yahweh be Elohim, then follow him. But if Baal, then follow him"? I don't think so. Now that's found in 1 Kings 18 verse 21. If you read the Hebrew text of 1 Kings 18 verse 19, he also mentioned the name of a female deity named Asherah. He mentioned their names as a means of identifying the names of who those people worshipped, but it was most certainly not in a worshipful or otherwise respectful way. And that's why in this presentation I do mention the name God, but not in a worshipful or respectful way. I'm identifying the name of a pagan deity whose name has been very cleverly applied as either the name or title of the true Creator. And for those who might want to see that the name Asherah does indeed appear in the Hebrew text, here's a scanned copy of the Hebrew text as taken from the Interlinear Bible, translated by J.P. Green. The Hebrew text of 1 Kings 18 verse 19 reads like this: "And now gather all Israel to me, to Mount Carmel, and 450 prophets of Baal and 400 of the prophets of Asherah, who eat at the table of Jezebel." So yes, Elijah mentioned the names of Baal and Asherah. He mentioned their names as a means of identifying the names of who those people worshipped, but it was most certainly not in a worshipful or otherwise respectful way. So yes, Elijah mentioned the names of Baal and Asherah. He mentioned their names as a means of identifying the names of who those people worshipped, but most certainly not in a worshipful or otherwise respectful way. And that's why in this presentation I do mention the name God, but not in a worshipful or respectful way. I'm identifying the name of a pagan deity whose name has been very cleverly applied as either the name or title of the true Creator. Okay, another important point that I feel is often either disregarded or ignored by a large contingency of the sacred name movement is the fact that believers who had been named after heathen idols were not expected to change their names. I've been acquainted with several members of the sacred name movement who, upon discovering that their name was associated with the name of a pagan deity, they changed it. Now, I'm not trying to say anything negative about those people. But then again, this does beg the question of why some pretty heavyweight believers mentioned in the New Testament, such as Apollos and Hermes, were never expected to change their names. I mean, if I say, "Hey Hermes, come here, I want to talk to you," am I not in a way giving a nod to the deity Hermes? Yet, that wasn't a concern. Hermes, I'm so sorry your mother named you after a pagan idol. Aren't you going to change your name? Of course, I addressed this fact only a few minutes ago within this presentation. While there are a few recorded instances of believers having their names changed, it's more the exception than the norm, and it never had anything to do with their original names having emanated from the name of a pagan idol. Maybe this goes to show that if believers didn't change their names even when they came to realize they were named after a pagan idol, then maybe we should think of the bigger picture and of how important it is that we don't tamper with the Creator's name. Okay, for the next dot I want to connect, I want to make certain you understand the wording in the yellow box really is blurred, sketchy, or smeared, however you want to describe it. It's mostly illegible. That's because it's a point that I really haven't focused on yet in this presentation, but I'm about to. And once we cover my currently blurry point, it won't be blurry at all. It will be clear. And once I make my currently blurry point clear, we should then hopefully be willing to accept my final point, that God is now the generally accepted translation of the Hebrew title Elohim, but not only that, but this same God is the same God whose worship Yahweh condemns. In fact, many of you, like me, were not only taught that God is an acceptable title for the true Creator, but that it's the English name of the Creator. And this is one of the most elaborate deceptions of all time. So cleverly orchestrated that even with a 5-part presentation like this, most people won't see or believe it's true. And I'm not even talking about those who aren't the least bit interested in investigating this subject. So is the name of the Creator really God? And if not, is God even an acceptable title for the Creator of the universe? That is the ultimate question. So let's get back to that blurred out point because it's time to unblur it, to uncover it. So here's the missing final point that, like all the ones that come before it, is critical. The worship of God spreads to other lands. The opposition, those who claim that God, the God of our English Bibles, isn't connected to the God whose worship is condemned by Yahweh, they want you to believe the worship of God was a localized form of idolatry that never expanded beyond the Middle East. Even on the surface, this argument defies logic and sound reasoning. Nevertheless, if you follow the breadcrumbs, so to speak, you can see that yes, the worship of the deity named God slithered around the globe, all the way across Eurasia, Europe, and yes, all the way to the United States and beyond. So let's examine the breadcrumbs and see where they lead. The breadcrumb trail starts in the Garden of Eden. We know from the Bible that it was the serpent who deceived Eve, successfully tempting her to eat from the tree of the knowledge of righteousness and evil. We know from the book of Enoch that the name of this serpent is Gadriel. And we know that if we shorten the serpent's name, it's God. And we hopefully know by now that G-A-D is correctly pronounced God in both Hebrew and Greek. It's only in English that we're taught that the false deity's name is pronounced Gad, as in sad, whereas the creator's name is God, as in sod. So just to be clear, it can be said that the serpent's name is God. And here's a refresher of a slide I've already displayed several times, but as we follow the breadcrumb trail, we know that by the time of Jacob, the false deity named God was worshipped not only in Haran, but Palmyra and Dura Europos. A point I previously made is basically this. Come on, if we know God was worshipped in that area, does that mean that's where it was confined? I've been told I'm a naive person, but come on, we should all know that just because no one has reported archaeological finds of carvings dedicated to an idol named God doesn't mean those people didn't worship God. And that brings me to another breadcrumb. So we're following breadcrumbs, and it's taking us to Russia. How can that be? What evidence is there that God was worshipped in Russia? Is it possible that the worship of an idol named God made its way to Russia? I'm not able to directly prove that an idol named God was worshipped in Russia, but there are some strong clues that he was, and maybe still is. To help us with our investigation, there's a dictionary called the Transliterated Dictionary of the Russian Language, edited by Eugene Garfield and published by ISI Press in 1979. In this dictionary, we find a very intriguing characteristic regarding words that begin with the prefix G-A-D. In fact, the very word spelled G-A-D, which we know is pronounced God, has the most intriguing meaning of all. So let's take a look. So here's an excerpt from page 23 of the portion of Garfield's dictionary titled Transliterated Russian English section. This dictionary is actually available online as a PDF file, and the link is posted on this slide for anyone who wants to check it out for themselves. But take a look at the words that begin with G-A-D. What does the word pronounced G-A or pronounced God, what does that word mean in Russian? Well, it says here it means reptile. Say, isn't a serpent a reptile? Isn't God the name of the serpent who tempted Eve to eat the forbidden fruit? The answer is yes. God, or Gadriel, is the name of the serpent who tempted Eve in the Garden of Eden. So is it just a coincidence that if you say the word God in Russian, it means reptile? And more importantly, is it just a coincidence that reptiles were worshipped in Russia? Although I've known for many years that the word pronounced God in the Russian language means reptile, I wasn't aware of the fact that Russians worshipped reptiles until fairly recently. I found this information in a book titled Irish Druids and Old Irish Religions by James Boswick. James Boswick published his book in the year 1894. On page 183 of his book, the author mentions that Muscovites and Lithuanians had serpent idols. Of course, Muscovites are inhabitants of Moscow, and Lithuania borders the eastern side of the Baltic Sea. He adds that in pagan Russia, the serpent was the protector of brides. Now please take a look at the last two sentences on this slide. It says, one of the symbols of both Hercules and the Celtic Hu was a serpent. Please remember the Celtic deity Hu, because we will see later that etymologists include the deity Hu in their own tracing the origin of the word God. Please also notice that the German white serpent gave wisdom to the eater of it, or so they believed. I hope we're not so naive as to not believe that the Germans, like everyone else out there, practiced serpent worship. I found additional information in a book titled Notes Upon Russia, Volume 2 by Sigismund von Herberstein, which was published in the year 1852. On page 99 of his book, von Herberstein describes the people living in a province named Samogithia. On page 97, von Herberstein tells us that Samogithia is a province that lies to the north of the Baltic Sea and is next to Lithuania. So, here's an excerpt from von Herberstein's work. Quote, "This province abounds in woods and forests in which horrible sights may occasionally be witnessed. For in them there dwell a considerable number of idolaters, who cherish, as a kind of household gods, a species of reptile, which has 4 short feet like a lizard, with a black fat body, not exceeding 3 palms in length. These animals are called giveawites, and on certain days are allowed to crawl about the house in search of the food which is placed for them. They are looked upon with great superstition by the whole family, until the time when, having satisfied their hunger, they return to their own place. But if any accident should occur to them, that is, to a member of their family, they believe that their household god, the reptile, has been ill received and ill fed." Unquote. So reptile worship was found in a province known as Samogithia in Lithuania. How did that happen? So we found that the word pronounced God in Russian means reptile, and we found reptile worship in Russia and westward into Lithuania. And here's a map showing the location of Samogithia within the country of Lithuania. I would say it's to the east of the Baltic Sea, not to the north, as reported by Sigismund von Herberstein in his book. Lithuania borders present-day Belarus, and Belarus borders Russia. But who's to say what those borders were as settlers made their way westward across present-day Russia and Europe? The point is, they worshipped serpents and reptiles. And by the way, as a reminder, the Russian word for reptile is God. We've already noted from James Bonwick's book that serpents were worshipped in Lithuania, and this map gives a broader overview of where things are. Samogithia is marked in red, and it is located within Lithuania. Let's take another look at the transliterated dictionary of the Russian language. We've already seen that the word pronounced God means reptile in Russian. But please notice that every single word that begins with GAD has a negative connotation. The very next word is gadalka, which means fortune teller. Is it just a coincidence that God is the Canaanite deity of fortune? That's what the opposition wants us to think. It's just a coincidence. I'm persuaded that it's much more than a coincidence. It's a connection. Then we come to the word gadit, which means foul, as in nasty. And gadyuka means adder. As we all hopefully know, an adder is a species of serpent. Now, if we move southwest along the Baltic Sea, we come to Poland. The Russian language and the Polish language are considered to be very similar, and sure enough, not only is the Russian word for reptile pronounced God, but so is the Polish word. And yet we know reptile worship was practiced in this vicinity. Of course, if we know reptile worship was practiced in these locations, it should be a given that it was practiced elsewhere as well. Now, just in case anyone thinks I'm manipulating the facts, here's a posting I found online several years ago. The caption for this photo says, "Saber-toothed cattle skeleton keeps its secrets at Delamar Dry Lake Bed, Nevada." In response, someone with the screen name I Am Adam wrote, "Oh my God." Then someone with the Russian name Uribrisk wrote, "Oh my God," and he used the Russian characters that spell out God. He added, quote, "God is a Russian for reptile, and it spells the same way as God," unquote. So Uribrisk saw the irony of saying, "Oh my God," in English while looking at the photo of a skeletal remain of an animal that resembles a reptilian creature. And the word reptile, as he confirmed, is translated God in the Russian language. So yes, if you say God in Russian, you are conveying a word that means reptile. I might add that if you want to jokingly tell someone, "You are so nasty," you would say, "You are so God." Let's see if we can follow the breadcrumbs. So let's say that God worship originated in the area of Haran, where Leah and Rachel were raised, and where most of Jacob's children were born. And let's say that the adversary, known as that old serpent the devil, wants to be worshipped. And let's say that a short form of his name is God, which means the serpent is God. I believe I have shown all this to be true, and hopefully we all know he wants to be worshipped. I haven't really covered this aspect of the devil, but it too is actually an important component in this discussion. I probably should have put that as my first dot in connecting the dots. In the famous temptation of Yeshua, the adversary, who we all know as Satan, tempted Yeshua and offered to give him all the kingdoms of the world if he would fall down and worship him. It's true that Yeshua addressed him as Satan, but in actual fact the word Satan isn't really his name. And according to the text of the Hebrew Matthew, Yeshua addressed him as Ha-Satan, which means the adversary. You don't put the word "the" in front of a person's name when you address him or her. When I speak with someone named Joe, I don't address him as the Joe. So to be clear, Satan is a noun, not a proper noun, and that noun means adversary, which Satan is. He is Yahweh's adversary. So if we truly want to put a name on the adversary, his name is God. So here in the book of Matthew chapter 4, the Satan, whose name is actually God, or God Real if we go along with what we read in the book of Enoch, So God wanted Yeshua to worship him, and Yeshua would not do so. Let's start reading with verse 8. Again the devil taketh him up into an exceeding high mountain, and showeth him all the kingdoms of the world, and the glory of them, and saith unto him, All these things will I give thee, if thou wilt bow down and worship me. Then saith Yeshua unto him, Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, Thou shalt worship Yahweh thy Elohim, and him only shalt thou serve. So yes, I probably should have put the fact that the devil wants to be worshipped as the very first dot to connect to all the others. Of course, there are other Bible passages that speak of the adversary's desire to be worshipped and to even take Yahweh's place, if such a thing were possible. Isaiah 14 is understood as a parable against the king of Babylon, but many Bible scholars see a parallel indictment against the adversary, who is behind all evil governments. Here's what we read in Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 20. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of El. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee, and consider thee, saying, Is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake the kingdoms? That made the world as a wilderness, and destroyed the cities thereof? That opened not the house of his prisoners? All the kings of the nations, even all of them, lie in glory, every one in his own house. But thou art cast out of thy grave like an abominable branch, and as the raiment of those that are slain, thrust through with the sword, that go down to the stones of the pit, as a carcass trodden under feet. Thou shalt not be joined with them in burial, because thou hast destroyed thy land and slain thy people. The seed of evildoers shall never be renowned. I think it's clear the adversary is the one being addressed here, but it's made even more clear in Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 1 through 19. Let's read those verses as a confirmation that the adversary wants to be worshipped. And if it were within his power, he would replace Yahweh, much as he has already replaced Yahweh's name with the Lord and inserted his own name, God, as a title that many to this day have mistaken for the Creator's actual name. Let's read Ezekiel chapter 28. The word of Yahweh came again unto me, saying, Son of man, say unto the prince of Tyrus, Thus saith Yahweh Almighty, because thine heart is lifted up, and thou hast said, I am a mighty one, I sit in the seat of the Almighty, in the midst of the seas. Yet thou art a man, and not the Almighty, though thou set thine heart as the heart of the Almighty. Behold, thou art wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that they can hide from thee. With thy wisdom and with thine understanding, thou hast gotten thee riches, and hast gotten gold and silver into thy treasures. By thy great wisdom and by thy traffic hast thou increased thy riches, and thine heart is lifted up because of thy riches. Therefore, thus saith Yahweh Almighty, because thou hast set thine heart as the heart of the Almighty, behold, Therefore I will bring strangers upon thee, the terrible of the nations. And they shall draw their swords against the beauty of thy wisdom, and they shall defile thy brightness. They shall bring thee down to the pit, and thou shalt die the deaths of them that are slain in the midst of the seas. Wilt thou yet say before him that slayeth thee, I am the Almighty? But thou shalt be a man and no mighty one in the hand of him that slayeth thee. Thou shalt die the deaths of the uncircumcised by the hand of strangers. For I have spoken it, saith Yahweh Almighty. Moreover, the word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation upon the king of Tyrus, and say unto him, Thus saith Yahweh Almighty, Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom, and perfect in beauty. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of the Almighty. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created. Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of the Almighty. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created, till iniquity was found in thee. By the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Therefore I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of the Almighty, and I will destroy thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. I will cast thee to the ground. I will lay thee before kings, that they may behold thee. Thou hast defiled thy sanctuaries by the multitude of thine iniquities, by the iniquity of thy traffic. Therefore will I bring forth a fire from the midst of thee, it shall devour thee. And I will bring thee to ashes upon the earth in the sight of all them that behold thee. All they that know thee among the people shall be astonished at thee. Thou shalt be a terror, and never shalt thou be any more. So here is what should have been the very first dot to connect. It's the key to the deception. The whole world seems to be collectively giving the devil exactly what he wants. Mankind collectively worships him, and we don't even know it. And can you imagine trying to persuade any of the plethora of television evangelists that the name and or title that they're attributing to the Creator is actually the name of the adversary? It's kind of like the quote from the Twilight Zone that I mentioned earlier. The narrator, Rod Serling, says, "It's too incredible to be real, too real to be a dream." And yet, it's very true, and it's very real. So let's get back to tracing the breadcrumbs and connecting the dots. We have shown without any question that God was worshipped in Haran, but not only that, God was worshipped in Dura Europos and Palmyra, cities that were at least 200 miles from each other. Is it safe to speculate that the worship of God expanded way beyond that area? Could it have traveled north? Well, we've seen that the word pronounced God in the Russian language means reptile. We've seen that reptiles were worshipped in Russia and Lithuania. And moving southwest into Poland, we've seen that the word pronounced God in Polish, just like in Russian means reptile. Is it even remotely possible that the reptile god is connected to the serpent named Gadrael from the Garden of Eden? Oh, and as we track westward, look which country comes next. It's Germany. Now in Germany, the dialect changes and God is pronounced Gott. But this can't be the same God that we've traced from Haran, can it? Or can it? We've already covered the fact that the Teutons, upon conversion to Christianity, applied Gott to the true Heavenly Father. You may also recall from a previous slide that pagan Germans believed eating a white serpent made them wiser. They attributed power to the serpent. Here's a slide I'm borrowing from part 1 of my presentation as a refresher for those who may not remember that the German pronunciation of God is Gott, plus that when the Teutonic peoples converted to Christianity, its pre-Christian meanings were applied to the Christian sense. They say God, quote, originally referred to that which is worshipped or invoked in sacrificial offerings. The article goes on to say, quote, with the conversion of the Teutonic peoples to Christianity, its pre-Christian meanings were largely reshaped and absorbed into the Judeo-Christian tradition, unquote. In other words, its pagan application was given a fresh, new look to make it look not so bad. So using this sort of reasoning, we can take any pagan or otherwise vile word, redefine it as something righteous, then insert it into a select verse to shine a positive light on it. We could potentially even take the word Lucifer and insert it into Matthew chapter 5, verse 14. Let's suppose for a moment that some large group of pagan worshippers was in the process of being converted to the true faith. But it turns out these former pagans just absolutely love the word Lucifer. And as they're in the process of being converted to our faith, they let us know they just can't bear the notion that we would frown upon them for using the word Lucifer. We could potentially say, well, you know, Lucifer is actually a simple Latin word that means light bringer or light bearer in Latin. So if we are the light of the world, that means we are light bearers. So yeah, we guess we could put out a Bible translation where Yeshua tells his followers that we are the Lucifer or the light bearers of the world. The problem is, Lucifer by now is universally recognized as a reference to the adversary, to Satan, if you will. But we might argue that we're simply taking a pagan application and reshaping it into something positive. Now you may recall from part 2 of my presentation that we've already had proponents of God tell us they would have no problem referring to Yahweh as their Zeus. Again, this is taking a known pagan name and reshaping it or redefining it as something positive, something righteous. That's where the road leads you if you uphold doing what the Teutonic tribes did, taking something pagan and transforming it, or as they would like to say, reshaping it into something righteous. Is it any wonder that the adversary is described as transforming himself into an angel of light? Isn't that what the adversary has been doing all along? Making something that is oh so wrong seem oh so right. The Apostle Paul clearly had a problem with deceitful people. The world is full of deceitful people. And I've even encountered several along this wilderness journey that I've been on. I could tell some stories, But let's suffice it to say, I agree with the Apostle Paul. I don't have any use for deceitful people. Verse 13, for such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Messiah. And no marvel. In other words, we shouldn't be surprised, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. This is taken from 2 Corinthians 11, verses 13 through 14. So I might say, those who transform the pagan god into what they believe is a noble name and or title for Yahweh, they are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming something evil into something righteous. And no marvel, as it's nothing to be surprised about, for Satan himself is transformed from an evil, rebellious angel into an angel of light. Those who transform the pagan god into what they believe is a noble name and or title for Yahweh are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming something evil into something righteous. And no marvel, as in it's nothing to be surprised about, for Satan himself is transformed from an evil, rebellious angel into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no big surprise if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. Now, just to be clear, these are my words, so I'm not trying to add anything to the Bible, just in case someone thinks that's what I'm doing here. But based on my research findings, that is exactly what is being done. It's a very subtle transformation, or shall I say, reshaping, and nearly the entire world has fallen for it. So by now, in our modern times, referring to Yahweh as God has become something perfectly natural and appropriate. So just to summarize the Teutonics' understanding of God, it was used in reference to the deities they worshipped, but reshaped or transformed into a clean, non-pagan word when they converted to Christianity. But who reshaped it? Who transformed it into a new and different meaning? Was it man, or was it Yahweh? And how did God find its way into the Teutonics' vocabulary in the first place? Was it just there? Or is it found along that trail we've been tracking across Europe? An even bigger question is, was God used by the Teutonic peoples as a title, as suggested by this reference, or was it used as a name? Please notice that if we continue reading on this slide, it says the word God was used to translate the Latin Deus, the Greek Theo, and the Hebrew Elohim. These are all titles. So it would appear, at least on the surface, that God was used by the Teutonic peoples as a title and not as a name. But is that really true? You may be surprised when you learn the truth. But first, let's identify who the Teutonic peoples were. So who exactly were the Teutonic peoples? Many of the references we've consulted present the Teutonic peoples as the ancient residents of what is now known as Germany. In fact, even as I began working on this presentation, I was still persuaded that the Teutonic peoples resided in what is now known as Germany. While that is true, the Teutonic peoples comprised way more than just Germany. The 1910 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica offers some insightful information about who the Teutonic peoples were and where they lived. Let's read what it says. Teutonic peoples. a comprehensive term for those populations of Europe which speak one or other of the various Teutonic languages vis-à-vis the English-speaking inhabitants of the British Isles, the German-speaking inhabitants of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Switzerland, the Flemish-speaking inhabitants of Belgium, the Scandinavian-speaking inhabitants of Sweden and Norway, and practically all the inhabitants of Holland and Denmark. To these, we have to add small German and Flemish-speaking communities in Italy and France and somewhat larger German and Swedish populations in Russia. Outside Europe, we have to include also the very numerous populations in America, Africa, and Australasia, etc., which have emigrated from the same countries. The statement that the Teutonic peoples are those which speak Teutonic languages requires a certain amount of qualification on one side. In the British Isles, especially Ireland, there is, in addition to the Celtic-speaking elements, a considerable population which claims Celtic nationality, though it uses no language but English. And further, all Teutonic communities contain to a greater or less degree certain immigrant, especially Semitic, elements which have adopted the languages of their neighbors. Notice I underlined the words especially Semitic. So just to be clear, the areas considered to be inhabited by the Teutonic people extend well beyond the borders of present-day Germany. As various tribes and clans migrated westward, it's only natural that rivals would separate and form their own clans, claiming their own lands and designating their own boundaries. I found this map at www.worldhistory.org, and it shows the distinction between the Teutonic peoples and the Celtic peoples. The Teutonic areas are shaded brown and the Celtic areas are dark blue. By the way, some claim that the word Celtic comes from a Latin word that means stone chisel. I also read somewhere that it means the tall ones. Others say it comes from a word that means boldness or ferocity. I'm unable to find any outright point of origin for either the Teutons or the Celtics, only theories. According to a first-century historian named Tacitus, the Teutons claimed to have originated from a man named Manus, who was himself the son of a deity named Twisto, who was the son of the earth. Now this sounds to me like a twisted claim, so suffice to say no one really knows for certain how and where the Teutonic peoples and their Celtic counterparts originated. The earliest recorded use of the name Celts dates to the year 517 BCE from a geographer named Hecataeus of Miletus. Suffice it to say the Celts have been around for a very long time. I'm personally persuaded that they all originated in the Middle East and together they form a portion of the scattered tribes of Israel. This map shows areas that were known to be inhabited by the Teutons and the Celts around the year 52 BCE. Okay, I want to go back to that extensive Encyclopedia Britannica article on the Teutonic peoples because it essentially corroborates everything from the map on my previous slide. According to the information in this very credible source, the two groups were at one time the same group. In fact, it appears that before there was ever a group known as the Teutons, everyone in that area of the world were known as the Celts. An author named Stephen Zimmer, in his article Teutonen, proposes that even the name Teutones may be interpreted as having been derived from the Proto-Celtic word tota, which means people or tribe. Stephen Zimmer's article was written in German, and I don't speak German, so thankfully a Wikipedia article provides a translation of a pertinent quote from his article. He writes, quote, "Thus the name Teutones may be interpreted as deriving from Proto-Celtic tota, which means people or tribe." Of course, Stephen Zimmer is only proposing a theory. But the point is, the Celts and the Teutons were at one time essentially the same group of people that eventually split off into their own separate divisions. You may be wondering why I'm taking the time to demonstrate that the Teutonic peoples and the Celtic peoples were at one time one and the same group of people. There is a reason for this, which you will soon see. Those who support referring to the Creator as God would most likely not appreciate this information because it will further demonstrate that the God we see in our English Bibles is traced not only to serpent worship, but also to the same God who was worshipped in Haran. I'm not saying they all worship God in the same exact way because people have a way of incorporating their own unique forms of worship into the faith that they practice, much like the differences we encounter here in the USA with people who worship Yahweh. So the various clans may have had their own unique ways of worshiping God, but they nevertheless worshiped a deity named God, and this deity they worshiped was most certainly not Yahweh. So here, in this Encyclopedia Britannica article on the Teutonic peoples, we find some interesting information on the Teutonics and the Celts. Obviously, I can't read the entire article due to time constraints, so let's just focus on the portions I highlighted. We read that, quote, with the beginning of the Iron Age, perhaps circa 500 to 400 BC, Celtic influence becomes apparent everywhere, unquote. Again, I tell you, this is important information for us to keep in mind as we trace the origin of God. So it appears Celtic influence came first, then came the Teutonics. So when did the Teutonics begin to emerge as a separate group? Well, let's read my next highlighted portion. It says, quote, the first recognition that the inhabitants of Germany, Holland, etc. were a people distinct from their Celtic neighbors dates from about the middle of the 1st century BC. Let's take another look at the map I showed. This map dates the separate groupings of the Celts and the Teutonic peoples to 52 BCE. And 52 BCE is right there in the middle of the 1st century BCE, just as we are told in the Encyclopedia Britannica article. Of course, the Celts and the Teutons didn't become separate groups overnight. It was obviously a gradual process. Okay, back to the Encyclopedia Britannica article. I think the most interesting quote on this page is found at the bottom. It says, quote, in none of the early records, however, do we get any clear indication that the Teutonic peoples were distinguished from the Celts, unquote. So, to the best of their research, at one time the Teutons and the Celts were one and the same. Also, please notice this other quote I highlighted on this slide in the right column. It says, quote, at the beginning of our era, the Teutonic peoples stretched from the Rhine River to the Vistula River, unquote. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Rhine River and the Vistula River, the Rhine River flows through western Germany, and the Vistula River flows through Poland. Here's a broad map that shows the basic locations of the Rhine River over here on the left and the Vistula River way over here on the right. Notice that the area I circled here pretty much matches the location of the Teutons on the other map I displayed. Here's another map to give you a closer look. The Rhine River forms the West German border, separating Germany from France. And then it flows northward through western Germany and empties into the North Sea. As I previously mentioned, the Vistula River flows right through the heart of Poland, going right through the capital of Poland, which is Warsaw. Now, why might it be interesting to know that the Teutonic peoples were not only found in Germany, but also in Poland? We will find out soon, just in case you haven't already figured it out. But if you haven't already figured it out, then you'll need to wait until Part 5b to find out. This is where I will bring this portion of Part 5, 5a that is, to a close, and in Part 5b we will delve into why it's so significant that the Teutonic peoples were not only found in Germany, but also in Poland. So thank you for your kind attention, and I hope you'll be able to stick around for Part 5b as I finish connecting all the dots. Shalom to you, and may Yahweh bless.